I watched helplessly as my mother-in-law stuffed my deceased mother's precious belongings into garbage bags, dismissing them as worthless junk, while my husband stood silent. 3 months later, when the appraiser's call came through, her voice, trembling with disbelief, those worthless items would expose a secret that changed everything. What she discovered hidden among my mother's humble possessions would shatter assumptions and transform my family's dynamics forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Marchetti, and until 3 months ago, I believed that family loyalty meant accepting disrespect in silence, that keeping peace required sacrificing my own dignity, and that speaking up for what mattered most would only create more problems than solutions. The transformation that followed would prove that sometimes the most profound vindication comes not from arguments or confrontations, but from truth revealing itself in the most unexpected ways. The morning that changed everything began like countless others in the Rodriguez household, where my husband Marcus and I had been living with his mother, Dolores, since our wedding 2 years earlier. The arrangement had seemed practical initially, a temporary solution while we saved money for our own place, but temporary had stretched into permanent as Dolores found increasingly creative ways to maintain control over our living situation and our relationship. Dolores Rodriguez commanded her household with the precision of a military general and the subtlety of a bulldozer. Every decision, from meal planning to weekend activities, required her approval and input. She had opinions about my career choices, my cooking abilities, my housekeeping standards, and most particularly my failure to produce grandchildren according to her carefully constructed timeline. The woman who had raised my husband to be respectful and hardworking had somehow failed to instill in him the courage to establish appropriate boundaries with his overbearing mother. The source of our most recent conflict was my mother's belongings, which had been stored in the garage since her death 6 months earlier. My mother, Isabella Marchetti, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 58. Leaving behind a modest apartment filled with the accumulated possessions of a woman who had lived through economic hardship but never lost her appreciation for beautiful things. The items were not valuable in any conventional sense, consisting primarily of vintage costume jewelry, old books, handmade quilts, ceramic figurines, and various pieces of furniture that showed their age, but retained their character. Dolores had been campaigning for weeks to have these belongings removed from her garage, claiming they were taking up valuable storage space and attracting dust that aggravated her allergies. Her complaints had escalated from subtle hints to direct demands, but I had resisted her pressure because these items represented my only remaining connection to my mother's memory and the life we had shared before her unexpected death. "Elena, we need to discuss this situation with your mother's things," Dolores announced during breakfast on a Tuesday morning in late October, her tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her directives followed without question. "I have been patient, but enough time has passed for you to sort through everything and make decisions about what to keep and what to dispose of properly." Marcus looked up from his coffee cup with the expression of a man who recognized the warning signs of an impending domestic crisis, but lacked the courage to intervene effectively. His strategy for managing conflicts between his wife and his mother consisted primarily of hoping they would resolve themselves without requiring him to choose sides or take positions that might displease either party. "I understand your concerns about the space," I replied carefully, attempting to maintain the diplomatic tone that had become second nature during my time in the Rodriguez household. "I have been meaning to go through everything systematically, but work has been demanding lately, and I want to make thoughtful decisions about items that have sentimental significance." Dolores dismissed my explanation with a wave of her hand that conveyed both impatience and authority. Sentimental value does not require keeping every single item indefinitely. You need to be practical about this situation and recognize that holding on to material possessions will not bring your mother back or change what happened. The conversation continued in this manner for several minutes, with Dolores presenting increasingly elaborate arguments about the necessity of clearing the garage while I offered reasonable explanations for why the process required more time and consideration. Marcus contributed occasional non-committal sounds that could be interpreted as agreement with whichever party seemed to be winning the discussion at any given moment. The situation reached its breaking point the following weekend when I returned from a work conference to discover that Dolores had taken matters into her own hands during my absence. She had enlisted Marcus to help her sort through my mother's belongings, according to her own criteria for what deserved preservation and what could be discarded immediately. The garage, which had contained dozens of boxes and pieces of furniture, just 3 days earlier, now held only a small stack of items that Dolores had deemed worthy of keeping. "Where are my mother's things?" I asked, surveying the dramatically altered space with growing alarm and disbelief. "We organized everything while you were away," Dolores replied, with the satisfaction of someone who had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. "The items worth keeping are right there, and the rest has been disposed of appropriately. It was long overdue, and now we can use the garage for its intended purpose again." The stack of remaining items consisted of perhaps a dozen pieces, a few photographs in frames, one small jewelry box, a single quilt that had been my grandmother's handiwork, and several books that Dolores had apparently considered sufficiently valuable to preserve. Everything else, including furniture that had been in my family for generations, my mother's collection of vintage brooches and necklaces, her handmade ceramics, and countless other items that held irreplaceable personal significance, had been loaded into a pickup truck and taken to the municipal dump while I was attending professional meetings 300 miles away. "You threw away my mother's belongings without asking me?" I stared at Marcus, searching his face for some indication that he understood the magnitude of what had occurred during my absence. "Mom said you had been putting off dealing with it." "For months," Marcus replied defensively, avoiding direct eye contact while presenting his mother's perspective as though it justified the decision to dispose of irreplaceable family heirlooms without consultation or consent. "She thought it would be easier if we just took care of everything while you were busy with work." The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which Marcus had been influenced by his mother's opinions about appropriate mourning periods, practical decision-making, and the necessity of moving forward rather than dwelling on past losses. Dolores had convinced him that my attachment to my mother's possessions was unhealthy, and that disposing of them would help me process my grief more effectively. She had presented their actions as an intervention designed to help me, rather than an invasion of my privacy and disregard for my emotional needs. "These were not just random objects," I explained, my voice steady despite the anger and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm my composure. "Every item had significance and memories attached. You had no right to make these decisions without consulting me, regardless of your opinions about the appropriateness of keeping them." Dolores responded with a lengthy lecture about the importance of being realistic about material possessions, the futility of trying to preserve everything from the past, and the necessity of making difficult decisions that serve practical rather than emotional purposes. She had researched the market value of vintage items and determined that nothing in my mother's collection had sufficient worth to justify the storage space and maintenance requirements. "Your mother was a lovely woman, but she was not wealthy, and her belongings reflected her circumstances," Dolores concluded. "Keeping costume jewelry and old furniture would not honor her memory in any meaningful way. What matters is remembering the person she was, not clinging to material objects that served their purpose during her lifetime." The argument continued, for hours, with Marcus attempting to mediate between his wife's emotional needs and his mother's practical concerns, while avoiding taking any position that might be construed as choosing sides definitively. His contributions consisted primarily of suggesting that everyone needed time to process the situation, and that perhaps some compromise could be reached that would address both perspectives appropriately. However, the damage had been completed, and no amount of discussion could restore items that had been disposed of permanently. My mother's lifetime of collecting, creating, and preserving beautiful things had been reduced to garbage in a single afternoon by people who viewed her possessions through the lens of monetary value rather than personal significance. The following weeks were marked by tension that permeated every interaction within the Rodriguez household. Dolores maintained that she had acted in everyone's best interests, and that time would prove the wisdom of her decision. Marcus oscillated between defending his mother's actions and acknowledging that perhaps they should have waited for my return before making such significant decisions. I struggled to process the loss of these tangible connections to my mother while managing the additional grief of having been betrayed by the people who should have understood and respected the importance of these items. The psychological impact of this violation extended far beyond simple disappointment about losing specific objects. The incident had revealed fundamental differences in how we valued emotional connections, respected personal boundaries, and made decisions that affected other family members. Dolores had demonstrated that she considered her judgment superior to mine, regarding matters that affected me directly and personally. Marcus had shown that his loyalty to his mother took precedence over his commitment to protecting his wife's interests and emotional well-being. These revelations forced me to confront difficult questions about the viability of our living arrangement and the long-term prospects for building a healthy marriage within a household where my needs and perspectives were consistently subordinated to Dolores's preferences and opinions. The woman who had raised my husband possessed many admirable qualities, but respect for boundaries and consideration for others' feelings were not among them. The irony of the situation was that Dolores had acted from her conviction that she was helping me move forward and process my grief more effectively. Her intentions, while misguided, had been focused on what she perceived as my best interests rather than malicious desires to hurt or punish me. This distinction made the situation more complex and difficult to address directly, as criticism of her actions could be characterized as ingratitude for her helpful intentions. However, intentions could not restore irreplaceable family heirlooms or undo the emotional trauma of discovering that precious possessions had been discarded like common trash. The impact of her well-meaning interference would resonate for months to come, affecting my relationship with both Marcus and Dolores in ways that none of us had anticipated when the garage cleanout began. As I stood in the nearly empty garage that evening, examining the small collection of items that had survived Dolores's purge, I realized that this experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for what mattered most, setting appropriate boundaries in family relationships, and recognizing when compromise was no longer possible or advisable. The woman who had always sought to maintain peace and avoid confrontation was beginning to understand that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost or family discord that might result. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Little did I know that within 3 months, a phone call from an appraiser would transform this story of loss and disrespect into something entirely different, proving that assumptions about value can be as wrong as assumptions about people. The items that Dolores had dismissed as worthless would soon be revealed to hold secrets that none of us had imagined. Secrets that would shift the balance of power in our household and validate everything I had tried to explain about the importance of preserving my mother's legacy. The garage cleanout had ended one chapter of my story, but it had also set in motion events that would ultimately prove that sometimes the most devastating losses lead to the most unexpected discoveries. Truth has a way of revealing itself when least expected, and justice has a tendency to emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when patience and persistence finally receive their due recognition. The transformation was about to begin, though none of us realized it yet. The weeks following the garage incident revealed layers of family dysfunction that I had previously managed to overlook or rationalize away through careful mental gymnastics and deliberate selective attention. Living in the Rodriguez household had required me to develop sophisticated coping mechanisms that allowed me to maintain emotional equilibrium while navigating the complex dynamics of a multi-generational family where respect flowed in only one direction and consideration was distributed according to hierarchy rather than human dignity. My marriage to Marcus had begun with genuine love and shared dreams about building a partnership based on mutual respect and collaborative decision-making. During our courtship, he had demonstrated thoughtfulness, independence, and the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested he would be capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries with his family while prioritizing our relationship. The man who had courted me with romantic gestures and meaningful conversations about our future together seemed to vanish the moment we crossed the threshold of his childhood home as a married couple. The transformation was so gradual that I had initially attributed it to normal adjustment challenges that any couple might face when establishing their household routines and learning to navigate extended family relationships. Marcus began deferring to his mother's opinions about everything from meal planning to weekend activities, justifying these concessions as temporary measures designed to maintain family harmony while we saved money for our own residence. However, temporary accommodations had evolved into permanent patterns of behavior that effectively subordinated our marriage to Dolores's preferences and expectations. Marcus had regressed into the role of dutiful son rather than equal partner, seeking his mother's approval for decisions that should have been made collaboratively between husband and wife. The confident, independent man I had married had been replaced by someone who measured every choice against his mother's likely reaction and adjusted his behavior accordingly. The garage incident had forced me to confront the reality that this pattern would not improve spontaneously or resolve itself through patience and understanding. Dolores had demonstrated her willingness to violate clear boundaries and disregard my emotional needs when they conflicted with her preferences. Marcus had revealed that his loyalty to his mother took precedence over his commitment to protecting and supporting his wife when conflicts arose between our interests. These revelations were devastating, not only because of what they indicated about my current circumstances, but also because of what they suggested about my future prospects within this family structure. If Marcus was unwilling or unable to establish appropriate boundaries with his mother regarding matters that affected me directly, how could I expect him to support me through the greater challenges that marriage inevitably presents over decades of shared life? The immediate aftermath of discovering my mother's belongings had been disposed of was characterized by intense grief that extended far beyond simple disappointment about losing specific objects. Each discarded item had represented a connection to memories, experiences, and aspects of my mother's personality that could never be replaced or replicated. The vintage brooches she had collected over decades told stories about special occasions, personal milestones, and her evolving sense of style and beauty. The handmade ceramics reflected her artistic sensibilities and her appreciation for craftsmanship that prioritized character over perfection. More significantly, these possessions had represented my mother's legacy and the values she had tried to instill in me about finding beauty in unexpected places, appreciating quality over quantity, and preserving things that mattered even when others failed to recognize their significance. Dolores's decision to discard these items as worthless junk was not simply poor judgment about market value. It was a fundamental rejection of everything my mother had represented and everything I had learned from her about what made life meaningful and rich. The psychological impact of this loss was compounded by the betrayal involved in having people I trusted make such consequential decisions without consultation or consideration for my feelings. Marcus and Dolores had not simply made an error in judgment. They had demonstrated that they did not consider my emotional needs and personal values important enough to warrant discussion or respect when they conflicted with practical considerations or convenience. This realization forced me to examine other aspects of my relationship with the Rodriguez family and recognize patterns of dismissal and disregard that I had previously minimized or explained away through generous interpretations of their intentions and motivations. Dolores regularly made decisions about household matters that affected me directly without seeking my input or considering my preferences. Marcus consistently supported his mother's choices even when they disadvantaged or inconvenienced me, justifying his position through appeals to family loyalty and requests for understanding and flexibility. The cumulative effect of these dynamics had been to establish me as a permanent guest in what was supposedly my own home, someone whose needs and opinions were considered but never prioritized when they conflicted with the preferences of the actual family members. I had accepted this subordinate position initially because I believed it would be temporary and because I wanted to demonstrate respect for family relationships and cultural traditions that prioritized elder authority and familial harmony. However, the garage incident had revealed that this arrangement was not temporary accommodation, but permanent assignment to secondary status within the family hierarchy. Dolores expected my compliance with her decisions and my gratitude for her guidance, regardless of whether those decisions served my interests or reflected my values. Marcus expected my understanding and support for his choices to prioritize family peace over spousal loyalty, regardless of the personal cost or emotional impact on our marriage. These expectations were not explicitly stated or formally negotiated. They were simply assumed based on cultural traditions and family patterns that had never been questioned or examined for their fairness or sustainability. The Rodriguez family operated according to established protocols that prioritized hierarchy, tradition, and authority over individual needs, personal autonomy, or collaborative decision-making. My attempts to address these issues through direct communication had been met with responses that minimized my concerns, questioned my motivations, or redirected responsibility back to me for being insufficiently understanding or appreciative of the family's efforts to include and support me. Dolores consistently framed her intrusive behavior as helpful assistance rather than boundary violations, making it difficult to object without appearing ungrateful or unreasonable. Marcus employed similar rhetorical strategies when confronted about his failure to support me during conflicts with his mother, presenting his neutrality as fairness and his unwillingness to choose sides as evidence of his commitment to maintaining family relationships rather than recognition of his abdication of spousal responsibility. These communication patterns had trained me to question my own perceptions and reactions, rather than challenging behavior that was clearly inappropriate and harmful. I had gradually learned to minimize my own needs, suppress my emotional responses, and accept treatment that I would never have tolerated from friends, colleagues, or strangers, because it was coming from family members who claimed to care about my welfare. The garage incident had shattered this carefully constructed rationalization system by presenting clear, undeniable evidence that my emotional needs and personal values were not simply being overlooked or misunderstood. They were being actively dismissed and disregarded by people who claimed to have my best interests at heart. The destruction of my mother's belongings could not be explained away as miscommunication, cultural differences, or well-intentioned assistance gone wrong. This recognition forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own role in perpetuating these dynamics, through my willingness to accommodate unreasonable demands and accept unacceptable treatment in the name of family harmony and marital stability. My desire to be understanding and flexible had been interpreted as permission to violate my boundaries and disregard my needs whenever they proved inconvenient or conflicted with other priorities. The weeks following the incident were marked by a profound shift in my perspective about what constituted appropriate behavior in family relationships and what level of disrespect I was willing to tolerate in exchange for superficial peace and stability. I began recognizing that true family harmony required mutual respect and consideration rather than unilateral accommodation and submission to authority. This emerging awareness created internal conflict as I struggled to reconcile my desire to maintain my marriage and family relationships with my growing recognition that those relationships were fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable in their current form. Marcus was not inherently a bad person, but he had been shaped by family dynamics that prevented him from developing the independence and courage necessary for healthy adult relationships. Dolores was not motivated by malice or cruelty, but her need to maintain control and authority over her family's decisions had created an environment where other people's autonomy and dignity were sacrificed to preserve her sense of importance and relevance. The family system that had produced these behaviors was deeply entrenched and resistant to change because it served the needs of those who held power while requiring sacrifice from those who did not. My professional life provided stark contrast to the dynamics I experienced at home, offering daily reinforcement of my competence, intelligence, and value as a contributing member of teams and organizations that respected my expertise and sought my input on important decisions. The disconnect between how I was treated in professional settings and how I was treated within my own family highlighted the artificial nature of the subordinate role I had accepted in the Rodriguez household. Colleagues and supervisors recognized my analytical abilities, communication skills, and leadership potential in ways that my own family members seemed incapable of acknowledging or appreciating. This external validation helped me maintain confidence in my own judgment and capabilities, despite the constant subtle messages at home that suggested my opinions and feelings were less important than those of other family members. The contrast also revealed that the problems I was experiencing were not inevitable results of my personality flaws or inadequate efforts to adapt to family expectations. I was perfectly capable of functioning effectively in complex social and professional environments when those environments operated according to principles of mutual respect and collaborative decision-making. This recognition gave me hope that change was possible while also highlighting the extent to which my current living situation was constraining my personal growth and emotional well-being. The woman who was succeeding professionally and earning respect from colleagues and clients was the same person who was struggling to maintain dignity and autonomy within her own family relationships. The garage incident had catalyzed a process of self-examination and boundary setting that would continue developing over the following months as I worked to understand what kind of relationships I was willing to accept and what changes were necessary to create a healthier family dynamic. The transformation would not be easy or comfortable, but it had become clear that continuing to accept unacceptable treatment was no longer a viable option for maintaining either my self-respect or my marriage. The woman who had always prioritized others' comfort over her own well-being was beginning to understand that true love and respect required honesty about problems rather than endless accommodation of dysfunction. The foundation for change had been established through pain and loss, but it would ultimately lead to discoveries that would validate everything I had tried to communicate about the importance of respecting what mattered most to people, even when others failed to understand its significance. The seeds of transformation had been planted in the ashes of my mother's discarded belongings, though none of us realized yet how dramatically those seeds would grow and what kind of harvest they would ultimately produce. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the most devastating losses, and sometimes the most important lessons emerge from the most painful experiences when courage and persistence are given time to develop their full potential. The journey toward reclaiming my voice and my dignity was about to begin in earnest. Though the destination remained hidden behind circumstances that seemed designed to test my resolve and challenge my commitment to creating the kind of life and relationships that honored both my mother's memory and my own values about what made existence meaningful and worthwhile. The month following my recognition of the family dysfunction marked the beginning of a systematic transformation in how I approached relationships, decisions, and my own sense of agency within circumstances that had previously felt overwhelming and unchangeable. Rather than continuing to react emotionally to each new instance of disrespect or boundary violation, I began developing strategic approaches to documenting patterns, gathering information, and positioning myself for eventual independence from the toxic dynamics that had characterized my marriage and living situation. The shift from passive accommodation to active observation required fundamental changes in how I processed daily interactions and interpreted the behavior of family members who had grown accustomed to my compliance and flexibility. Instead of automatically adjusting my expectations and responses to minimize conflict, I began maintaining detailed records of incidents that demonstrated the systematic nature of the disrespect I had been experiencing and rationalizing away through generous interpretations and self-blame. My professional background in project management and data analysis provided valuable frameworks for approaching personal relationships with the same systematic thinking that had proven effective in workplace environments. The skills I used daily to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement changes in complex organizational settings were equally applicable to understanding family dynamics and creating strategies for addressing dysfunction that had persisted unchallenged for decades. The documentation process began with a private journal where I recorded specific examples of boundary violations, disrespectful treatment, and instances where my needs and preferences were dismissed or overruled without consideration or discussion. The initial entries focused on obvious incidents like the garage cleanout, but as I became more aware of subtle patterns, I began recognizing dozens of smaller examples that collectively demonstrated the systematic nature of my subordination. Within the family hierarchy, Dolores had established elaborate protocols for managing household decisions that ensured her involvement and approval in matters ranging from grocery purchases to social commitments, effectively preventing Marcus and me from developing independent decision-making processes or autonomous adult relationships. Her interventions were typically framed as helpful suggestions or generous offers of assistance, making it difficult to object without appearing ungrateful or unreasonable. Marcus had developed corresponding patterns of behavior that supported his mother's control through consistent deferral to her preferences and systematic avoidance of situations that might require him to choose between supporting his wife and maintaining his mother's approval. His conflict avoidance strategies had evolved into sophisticated methods for redirecting responsibility and minimizing his role in perpetuating family dysfunction. The documentation process revealed the extent to which these patterns had shaped my own behavior and self-perception over the previous 2 years. I had gradually learned to anticipate their reactions and adjust my requests, expectations, and expressions of need to minimize the likelihood of conflict or disapproval. The constant self-monitoring and emotional regulation required to maintain family harmony had become exhausting and psychologically damaging. Recognition of these patterns provided the foundation for developing alternative approaches that prioritized my emotional well-being and personal autonomy while maintaining the superficial cooperation necessary to avoid open conflict during the transition period. I began practicing strategic communication techniques that established clear boundaries without providing obvious targets for criticism or manipulation. The most significant change involved my decision to research my mother's belongings more thoroughly before accepting that their disposal represented a permanent and irreversible loss. My initial grief and anger had prevented me from thinking systematically about what had been discarded and whether any documentation or records might exist that could provide information about items that Dolores had dismissed as worthless costume jewelry and outdated furniture. My mother had been meticulous about maintaining records of her purchases, particularly items that she had acquired from estate sales, antique shops, and specialty dealers who focused on vintage and collectible merchandise. Her organizational systems had been more sophisticated than I had realized during her lifetime, reflecting knowledge and expertise about evaluating and preserving valuable items that she had developed through decades of careful collecting and research. The surviving items from Dolores's purge included several photograph albums and a small wooden box that contained various documents related to my mother's personal affairs. As I examined these materials more carefully, I discovered detailed records of purchases, appraisals, and correspondence with dealers and collectors who had provided information about the provenance and significance of items in her collection. The documentation revealed that my mother had been far more knowledgeable about antiques and collectibles than I had understood, with particular expertise in vintage jewelry, ceramics, and textiles that had been acquired through systematic research. and careful evaluation rather than random accumulation of objects that appealed to her aesthetically. Her collection had been curated according to specific criteria that emphasized historical significance, craftsmanship quality, and investment potential rather than simple personal preference or decorative appeal. Among the papers was correspondence with several professional appraisers who had evaluated portions of her collection for insurance purposes and estate planning considerations. The letters included detailed descriptions of specific items, their estimated values, and recommendations for proper preservation and storage to maintain their condition and marketability over time. One letter from a certified appraiser named Dr. Margaret Thornfield, who specialized in vintage jewelry and decorative arts, provided particularly valuable information about several pieces that my mother had acquired from estate sales during the 1990s. Dr. Thornfield's assessment indicated that these items had historical significance and substantial monetary value that far exceeded what their appearance might suggest to casual observers unfamiliar with their provenance and craftsmanship. The correspondence was dated approximately 3 years earlier and included recommendations that my mother have the collection reevaluated periodically to account for changes in market conditions and collector demand that could affect the insurance, coverage, and estate planning implications of owning such items. Dr. Thornfield had expressed particular interest in several pieces that she described as exceptional examples of their type, with potential museum-quality significance. This discovery fundamentally altered my understanding of what had been lost when Dolores disposed of my mother's belongings, based on her superficial assessment of their worth and significance. The items that had been discarded as costume jewelry and worthless decorative objects included pieces that professional appraisers had identified as valuable collectibles with historical importance and substantial monetary worth. The revelation also provided new perspective on my mother's character and capabilities, revealing aspects of her intelligence and expertise that I had not fully appreciated during her lifetime. Her interest in antiques and collectibles had been far more sophisticated than I had realized, reflecting systematic knowledge and careful judgment rather than simple aesthetic preferences or nostalgic attachment to beautiful objects. The documentation process extended beyond reviewing my mother's papers to include research into the current market conditions for the types of items that had been disposed of during the garage cleanout. Online databases, auction records, and collector publications provided extensive information about recent sales and valuations for vintage jewelry, ceramics, and textiles, similar to those in my mother's collection. The research revealed that market demand and prices for many categories of vintage items had increased significantly during the previous several years, driven by renewed interest from younger collectors and investors who appreciated the craftsmanship and historical significance of objects produced during earlier periods. Items that might have seemed outdated or unfashionable to casual observers were commanding substantial prices from knowledgeable buyers who understood their significance and rarity. This information provided concrete evidence that Dolores's assessment of my mother's belongings as worthless junk had been fundamentally incorrect, based on assumptions and superficial judgments rather than informed evaluation of their actual characteristics and market value. Her decision to dispose of these items without consultation or professional appraisal represented not only emotional insensitivity, but also poor financial judgment that had resulted in significant monetary loss. The research process also revealed my own capacity for systematic investigation and analysis when properly motivated and focused on clear objectives. The skills I had developed through professional experience proved directly applicable to personal challenges that required persistence, attention to detail, and strategic thinking about complex problems with multiple variables and uncertain outcomes. More importantly, the research provided a sense of purpose and direction during a period when I had felt powerless and overwhelmed by circumstances that seemed beyond my control or influence. The systematic approach to understanding what had been lost and evaluating options for addressing the situation gave me concrete goals and measurable progress indicators that helped restore confidence in my ability to effect positive change through focused effort and strategic action. The documentation and research activities also provided valuable emotional benefits, by transforming my grief and anger into productive energy, directed toward understanding the truth about my mother's collection and developing appropriate responses to the injustice that had occurred. Instead of ruminating about past losses or feeling victimized by other people's decisions, I was actively working to gather information and create possibilities for addressing the situation constructively. The process revealed connections between my mother's interests and expertise that I had not previously recognized, providing new appreciation for her intelligence and sophistication in areas where I had assumed she was simply following personal preferences without deeper knowledge or understanding. Her collection had been assembled according to principles and criteria that reflected substantial education and experience in evaluating quality, authenticity, and significance. As my research progressed, I began developing relationships with professionals in the antiques and collectibles industry who could provide additional information about the types of items that had been in my mother's collection. These conversations revealed the existence of extensive networks of dealers, collectors, and appraisers who maintained detailed records of significant pieces and their ownership history. Several individuals expressed interest in learning more about my mother's collection and offered to review any documentation or photographs that might help identify specific items and their current whereabouts. The antiques community was smaller and more interconnected than I had realized, with many professionals maintaining informal networks for tracking important pieces and assisting collectors with research and authentication needs. The emerging picture suggested that my mother's collection had included items that were known within specialist circles, and that professional appraisers and dealers might have records or knowledge that could help establish what had been lost, and potentially assist with recovery efforts if the items had been sold or donated rather than destroyed. This possibility introduced new dimensions to my research efforts and provided hope that the damage caused by Dolores's decision might not be as permanent and irreversible as I had initially assumed. Professional networks and databases might contain information that could help identify the current location of valuable items and create opportunities for recovery or compensation that would address both the financial and emotional losses involved. The systematic approach to understanding and addressing the situation had transformed my perspective from passive victimization to active problem-solving, providing concrete goals and measurable progress that helped restore my sense of agency and control over circumstances that had initially seemed overwhelming and unchangeable. The woman who had always accommodated other people's preferences was discovering her capacity for independent research, strategic thinking, and persistent pursuit of objectives that mattered to her personally and professionally. The foundation for eventual transformation had been established through careful documentation, systematic research, and development of professional relationships that would prove essential for the discoveries that were about to emerge from my patient and persistent investigation into my mother's true legacy and the significance of what had been so carelessly discarded by people who failed to understand its value and importance. The systematic research into my mother's collection had opened doors to a professional community that operated according to principles of expertise, documentation, and mutual respect that stood in stark contrast to the family dynamics I had been navigating for the previous 2 years. The antiques and collectibles industry comprised individuals who valued knowledge, attention to detail, and systematic approaches to understanding the significance and worth of objects that others might dismiss as outdated or irrelevant. Dr. Margaret Thornfield responded to my initial inquiry within 48 hours, expressing genuine concern about the loss of items that she remembered evaluating during her previous consultation with my mother. Her professional correspondence demonstrated the kind of respect and consideration that had become foreign concepts within my household, treating my concerns as legitimate and my mother's collection as worthy of serious attention and expert analysis. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Thornfield wrote in her initial response, "I recall your mother's collection quite vividly, as it contained several exceptional pieces that represented significant examples of their respective categories. The loss you describe represents not only personal tragedy, but also the destruction of items with substantial historical and monetary value that should have been preserved for future generations. The professional validation was both relieving and devastating, confirming my instincts about the significance of what had been discarded while highlighting the magnitude of the loss that had resulted from Dolores's uninformed decision-making and Marcus's failure to protect my interests. Dr. Thornfield's assessment provided objective confirmation that my emotional attachment to my mother's belongings had been based on genuine understanding of their importance, rather than irrational sentimentality or inability to accept reasonable limitations. Dr. Thornfield offered to review any remaining documentation from my mother's collection and provide updated assessments of items that had survived the disposal process. More significantly, she volunteered to contact colleagues within her professional network who might have knowledge of similar pieces or access to databases that tracked the movement of significant collectibles through estate sales, auctions, and private transactions. The conversation that followed revealed the sophisticated infrastructure that existed within the antiques community for documenting, tracking, and preserving knowledge about items with historical significance and monetary value. Professional appraisers maintained extensive records of their evaluations. Dealers documented their acquisitions and sales, and collectors often photographed and cataloged their holdings for insurance and estate planning purposes. Dr. Thornfield explained that items from significant collections often generated interest and attention within specialist communities, particularly when they appeared at estate sales, auction houses, or donation centers where their provenance and significance might not be immediately apparent to general buyers. Professional networks existed specifically to identify and preserve such items when they became available through various channels. Your mother's collection was distinctive enough that several pieces would be recognized by knowledgeable dealers and collectors if they appeared in local markets, Dr. Thornfield explained during our first telephone consultation. The vintage jewelry alone included examples that are quite rare and would attract attention from specialists who follow such items closely. This information introduced possibilities that I had not previously considered, suggesting that the YD items disposed of by Dolores might not have been permanently destroyed, but could have been donated, sold, or otherwise transferred to individuals or organizations where they remained intact and potentially recoverable. The municipal dump represented only one possible destination for unwanted household goods, and many communities maintained recycling centers, donation facilities, and resale operations that diverted useful items from waste disposal systems. The research process expanded to include systematic investigation of local organizations that received donated household goods, operated thrift stores and consignment shops, or specialized in estate sales and liquidation services. Each facility maintained different procedures for accepting, processing, and reselling donated items, creating multiple pathways through which valuable pieces might have entered secondary markets, where they could be identified and potentially recovered. The investigation required developing relationships with managers and staff members at various facilities who could provide information about recent donations and assist with identifying items that matched descriptions from my mother's collection. The conversations revealed the informal networks that existed among people who worked regularly with donated goods and had developed expertise in recognizing valuable items that might be overlooked by casual observers. Maria Santos, who managed the receiving department at the largest local thrift store, proved particularly knowledgeable about procedures for handling unusual or potentially valuable donations. Her experience had taught her to recognize items that required specialist evaluation rather than immediate placement in general sales areas, and she maintained relationships with local appraisers and dealers who provided consultation services when significant pieces appeared. "We see everything here," Maria explained during my visit to her facility. "People donate items without understanding their value, and we try to identify pieces that deserve special attention. Your mother's jewelry sounds like the kind of collection that would have been flagged for professional evaluation if it had come through our system." Maria offered to review photographs and descriptions of items from my mother's collection and check against recent donations that had been processed through their facility. She also provided contact information for other organizations in the region that handled similar materials and might have relevant information about items matching the descriptions I could provide. The systematic approach to investigating potential recovery options required developing detailed documentation that could be shared with multiple contacts throughout the region. I created comprehensive lists of items from my mother's collection, including photographs from family albums that showed her wearing or displaying various pieces, descriptions based on her own records and correspondence with appraisers, and market information that demonstrated their significance and current value. The documentation process revealed the extent of my mother's sophistication as a collector and her systematic approach to building a collection that reflected both personal aesthetic preferences and informed understanding of historical significance and investment potential. Her records included purchase receipts, authenticity certificates, insurance appraisals, and correspondence with dealers and fellow collectors that demonstrated deep engagement with the antiques community. One particularly significant discovery involved correspondence with a dealer named Robert Chen, who specialized in vintage jewelry from the Art Deco period. The letters indicated that my mother had purchased several important pieces through his gallery and had maintained an ongoing relationship for consultation and authentication services over a period of several years. Robert Chen's business operated from a location approximately 50 miles from our city, serving collectors throughout the region with expertise in evaluating and acquiring significant pieces from estate sales and private collections. His correspondence with my mother indicated genuine respect for her knowledge and judgment, treating her as a serious collector rather than casual buyer of decorative objects. The decision to contact Robert Chen directly represented a significant step in my investigation, moving beyond passive research to active engagement with professionals who might have specific knowledge about my mother's collection and connections within the industry that could assist with recovery efforts. The conversation that followed provided crucial information about the scope and significance of what had been lost and the realistic possibilities for recovery through various channels. Isabella Marchetti was one of our most knowledgeable clients, Robert Chen explained when I reached him by telephone. She had exceptional taste and understanding of quality, particularly in Art Deco jewelry and ceramics. The pieces she acquired through our gallery were carefully selected examples that represented the best work of their respective periods and makers. Robert Chen confirmed that my mother's collection had included items with substantial monetary value and historical significance that would be recognized immediately by knowledgeable dealers and collectors if they appeared in secondary markets. He offered to circulate descriptions and photographs among his professional contacts and to notify me immediately if any matching pieces appeared through his network. The conversation also revealed additional dimensions of my mother's involvement with the collecting community that I had not previously understood. She had attended auctions, participated in collector societies, and maintained friendships with other enthusiasts who shared her interests and expertise. These relationships had provided access to information about available pieces and market conditions that had informed her purchasing decisions and collection development strategies. Robert Chen provided contact information for several individuals who had known my mother personally and might have additional insights about her collection or connections within the community that could assist with recovery efforts. The prospect of speaking with people who had appreciated my mother's knowledge and respected her expertise provided emotional comfort while expanding the network of professionals who could provide assistance. The investigation had evolved from personal research project to systematic recovery effort, involving multiple professionals and organizations throughout the region. Each contact provided additional information and connections that expanded the scope of the search while increasing the likelihood that valuable items could be identified and potentially recovered through various channels. The process also revealed my own capacity for developing professional relationships and managing complex projects that required coordination among multiple parties with different expertise and objectives. The skills I had developed through my Career proved directly applicable to personal challenges that required persistence, strategic thinking, and effective communication with diverse stakeholders. More significantly, the investigation had connected me with a community of professionals who operated according to principles of mutual respect, shared expertise, and collaborative problem-solving that provided stark contrast to the family dynamics I had been experiencing. The antiques community valued knowledge over hierarchy, expertise over authority, and results over compliance with traditional expectations. The interactions with dealers, appraisers, and collectors had reinforced my confidence in my own judgment and analytical abilities while providing validation for my mother's sophistication and expertise in areas where her family had failed to recognize her knowledge and accomplishments. The professional respect she had earned within the collecting community provided new perspective on her character and capabilities. The emerging network of contacts and potential resources had transformed the situation from hopeless loss to active investigation with realistic possibilities for positive outcomes. The systematic approach to understanding and addressing the problem had created momentum and direction that helped focus my energy on productive activities rather than emotional processing of past losses. The foundation had been established for the discoveries that would soon emerge from my persistent investigation and the professional relationships that had developed through systematic engagement with people who understood the true significance of what had been discarded so carelessly. The woman who had been dismissed and disregarded by her own family was earning respect and support from strangers who appreciated her dedication to preserving her mother's legacy and recovering items that deserved preservation rather than destruction. The transformation from passive victim to active investigator had positioned me to receive information and opportunities that would soon validate everything I had tried to communicate about the importance of respecting what mattered to people, even when others failed to understand its significance or value. The network of professionals who had committed to assisting with the recovery effort would soon provide the foundation for discoveries that exceeded everyone's expectations and changed the dynamics within my family permanently. The systematic investigation into my mother's collection had revealed layers of significance and value that extended far beyond what any of us had understood during her lifetime or immediately following her death. The professional relationships I had developed within the antiques community were providing access to information and resources that transformed my understanding of what had been lost and what possibilities existed for addressing the situation through legal, professional, and strategic channels. 3 weeks into my expanded research efforts, Robert Chen contacted me with information that fundamentally altered the scope and implications of the investigation. His network of professional contacts had identified several items that matched descriptions from my mother's collection, pieces that had appeared at various locations throughout the region during the time frame when Dolores had disposed of the belongings from our garage. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have located what appears to be a significant portion of your mother's jewelry collection," Robert Chen explained during our telephone conversation. The pieces were donated to the Riverside Community Foundation's annual charity auction, where they were cataloged as costume jewelry and vintage accessories. The auction is scheduled for next month, but the items are currently being held at their preview center for preliminary evaluation. The discovery that my mother's collection had not been destroyed, but had instead entered the charitable auction system, created both opportunities and complications that required immediate attention and strategic response. The items remained intact and potentially recoverable, but their current status as donated auction merchandise involved legal and procedural considerations that needed professional guidance and careful navigation. Robert Chen offered to accompany me to the preview center for formal identification of the pieces and professional evaluation of their significance and current market value. His expertise would provide the credibility and documentation necessary to establish the importance of the items and support any legal actions that might be required to address their improper disposal without appropriate authority or consultation. The Riverside Community Foundation operated one of the region's most respected charitable auction programs, handling donations of artwork, antiques, and collectibles from estate sales and private donors throughout the metropolitan area. Their annual auction attracted serious collectors and dealers from across the state, generating substantial revenue for local social service programs and community development initiatives. Margaret Williams, the Foundation's Director of Development, agreed to meet with Robert Chen and me to review the items in question and discuss the circumstances surrounding their donation. Her professional background included extensive experience with estate donations and the complex legal issues that could arise when items of significant value were donated without proper authority or adequate documentation of ownership rights. We receive hundreds of donations each year, and we depend on donors to represent accurately their authority to transfer ownership of contributed items, Margaret Williams explained during our initial meeting. When questions arise about provenance or donation authority, we have established procedures for investigating the circumstances and addressing legitimate concerns from affected parties. The Preview Center maintained professional standards for cataloging and displaying donated items that reflected the Foundation's commitment to accuracy and transparency in their auction operations. Each piece was photographed, described, and evaluated by qualified appraisers who provided preliminary assessments of condition, authenticity, and estimated market value based on current collecting trends and recent sale results. The examination of items that had been cataloged as part of the recent donation revealed the extent of the Foundation's professional expertise and their systematic approach to evaluating contributed materials. However, it also demonstrated the limitations of preliminary assessments conducted without access to provenance documentation or detailed knowledge of specific pieces and their collecting history. Robert Chen's examination of the jewelry that had been attributed to the donation from our household confirmed that the pieces included several items of exceptional significance that had been substantially undervalued in the preliminary catalog. Descriptions. His expertise revealed details about craftsmanship, materials, and maker identification that had not been apparent to the Foundation's general appraisers. These pieces represent some of the finest examples of Art Deco jewelry design that I have encountered in recent years, Robert Chen explained to Margaret Williams while examining a particularly elaborate brooch that had been cataloged as vintage costume jewelry. The craftsmanship and materials indicate museum-quality work by recognized masters of the period, with current market values that exceed the preliminary estimates by substantial margins. The systematic review of the donated items revealed that my mother's collection had included pieces with individual values ranging from several $100s to more than $10,000, depending on their rarity, condition, and provenance. Documentation. The total value of the jewelry alone exceeded $50,000, with additional items in ceramics and decorative arts that brought the overall collection value to nearly $80,000. The revelation that items dismissed as worthless costume jewelry and outdated decorative objects actually represented a collection worth nearly $80,000 created immediate legal and ethical questions about the circumstances surrounding their donation and the authority of the individuals who had made the decision to dispose of them without proper evaluation or consultation. Margaret Williams expressed serious concern about the Foundation's potential liability for accepting and processing donations that had been made without appropriate authority from the actual owners of the items. Her organization's reputation and legal standing depended on maintaining ethical standards and addressing legitimate ownership disputes through fair and transparent procedures. The Foundation cannot proceed with auctioning items that may have been donated without proper authority, Margaret Williams stated after reviewing the documentation I had provided about my mother's collection and the circumstances surrounding its disposal. We must investigate the donation process and determine the appropriate response to address the concerns you have raised about ownership rights and proper authorization. The investigation into the donation process revealed that Dolores had represented herself as the legal owner of the items when she delivered them to the Foundation's collection center. She had provided minimal documentation, but had signed legal attestations confirming her authority to transfer ownership of the contributed materials to the foundation for their charitable auction program. The foundation's standard procedures required donors to confirm their legal authority to transfer ownership rights, but they did not typically require extensive documentation or verification when dealing with household goods and personal property that appeared to represent normal estate cleanout activities. Dolores had presented the donation as disposal of items from a recently deceased family member, which fit common patterns for estate-related contributions. However, the discovery that the donated items included pieces with substantial monetary value and potential legal complications required more detailed investigation into the authorization process and the relationships among the parties involved in the donation decision. The Foundation's legal counsel would need to review the situation and determine appropriate procedures for addressing ownership disputes while protecting the organization's interests and maintaining their charitable mission. The legal complexities involved in recovering improperly donated items required professional guidance from attorneys who specialized in property rights, estate law, and charitable organization regulations. The consultation process revealed multiple avenues for addressing the situation, ranging from direct negotiation with the Foundation to formal legal proceedings that could establish ownership rights and require return of the items or compensation for their value. Attorney David Morrison, who specialized in estate and property law, provided comprehensive analysis of the legal options available for addressing the improper disposal of my mother's belongings. His assessment confirmed that Dolores had exceeded her authority in donating items that belonged to me as the legal heir to my mother's estate, regardless of the storage location or temporary arrangements that had been made for the items following my mother's death. The fundamental legal question involves who had authority to dispose of these items and whether the donation was made with proper authorization from the actual owner, Attorney Morrison explained during our consultation. The evidence indicates that your mother-in-law donated property that belonged to you without obtaining consent or legal authority to make such transfers on your behalf. The legal analysis also revealed potential claims for damages that extended beyond the simple monetary value of the donated items. The disposal had been conducted in a manner that demonstrated deliberate disregard for ownership rights and caused emotional distress through the destruction of irreplaceable family heirlooms and personal property with significant sentimental value. Attorney Morrison recommended initiating formal communications with both the Foundation and Dolores to establish the facts surrounding the donation and seek resolution through negotiation before pursuing litigation options that could be more costly and time-consuming for all parties involved. The documentation I had assembled provided strong evidence for ownership claims and demonstrated the substantial value of the items in question. The process of preparing formal legal communications required comprehensive documentation of the ownership rights, the circumstances surrounding the improper disposal, and the monetary and emotional damages that had resulted from the unauthorized donation of valuable personal property. The systematic approach to building the legal case reinforced the importance of the research and documentation efforts I had undertaken during the previous months. The investigation had also revealed broader patterns of behavior that extended beyond the specific incident involving my mother's collection. Dolores had made similar decisions about other aspects of household management and family affairs, without appropriate consultation or consideration for the rights and preferences of other family members who were affected by her choices. The legal consultation provided perspective on the broader implications of establishing appropriate boundaries and accountability for decision-making within family relationships. Attorney Morrison explained that legal remedies existed for addressing situations where family members exceeded their authority and caused financial or emotional harm through unauthorized actions that affected other people's property rights and personal interests. The systematic investigation into the improper disposal of my mother's belongings had evolved into a comprehensive examination of family dynamics, property rights, and legal accountability that would establish precedents for future interactions and decision-making processes within the Rodriguez household. The evidence I had assembled demonstrated clear violations of ownership rights and provided foundation for demanding significant changes in how family decisions were made and implemented. More significantly, the investigation had revealed my own capacity for systematic research, professional relationship development, and strategic problem-solving that had produced concrete results and created realistic possibilities for addressing injustices that had initially seemed permanent and irreversible. The skills and expertise I had applied to the situation had earned respect from legal and antiques professionals who recognized the thoroughness and effectiveness of my approach. The transformation from passive victim of family dysfunction to active advocate for my own rights and interests had positioned me to address not only the immediate situation involving my mother's collection, but also the broader patterns of disrespect and boundary violations that had characterized my relationships with Marcus and Dolores since the beginning of our marriage. The documentation and legal analysis had provided objective validation for concerns that had been dismissed or minimized by family members who preferred to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their behavior and its impact on other people. The professional assessment of the situation confirmed that my responses to the improper disposal had been reasonable and justified rather than excessive or emotionally driven. The foundation for demanding accountability and establishing appropriate boundaries had been established through systematic investigation and professional consultation that provided credible evidence and legal authority for addressing family dysfunction that had persisted unchallenged for too long. The woman who had been trained to accommodate unreasonable demands and accept unacceptable treatment was discovering her capacity for effective advocacy and strategic action that could produce meaningful change in circumstances that had previously seemed unchangeable. The stage was set for confronting the individuals responsible for the improper disposal and demanding appropriate remedies for the financial and emotional damages that had resulted from their unauthorized actions. The investigation had provided both the evidence and the confidence necessary to challenge family dynamics that had subordinated my rights and interests to the preferences and convenience of people who had demonstrated their unwillingness to respect boundaries or consider the impact of their decisions on others. The legal consultation with Attorney Morrison had provided clarity about my rights and options, but it had also revealed the extent to which the family dysfunction within the Rodriguez household had created patterns of behavior that would likely escalate rather than improve without decisive intervention. The discovery that my mother's collection possessed substantial monetary value represented only the most dramatic example of decision-making processes that consistently prioritized convenience and authority over respect and consideration for affected parties. The week following my meeting with the Riverside Community Foundation brought a series of incidents that demonstrated how deeply entrenched the problematic dynamics had become and how resistant Marcus and Dolores were to acknowledging the legitimacy of my concerns or the necessity of changing their approach to family decisions. Rather than expressing concern about the legal implications of the improper donation or demonstrating willingness to address the situation constructively, both individuals responded with defensive strategies designed to minimize their responsibility and redirect focus toward my allegedly excessive reactions to normal family processes. Dolores initiated this defensive campaign during a conversation that occurred when I attempted to discuss the Foundation's findings and the legal consultation I had undertaken to understand my options for addressing the unauthorized disposal of valuable property. Her response revealed the sophisticated rationalization systems she had developed to justify behavior that served her preferences, while dismissing the legitimate interests and rights of other family members. "Elena, I understand that you are upset about the donation, but you need to maintain perspective about what actually happened," Dolores stated, with the authoritative tone she typically employed when addressing challenges to her decision-making authority. "I made a reasonable decision about items that were taking up valuable storage space and creating ongoing problems for our household management. The fact that some appraiser claims they were worth money does not change the practical reality that keeping them indefinitely was not a viable long-term solution. Her argument demonstrated the extent to which she had internalized justifications that prioritized her convenience and preferences over my ownership rights and emotional needs. The monetary value of the donated items was dismissed as irrelevant, information that did not affect the appropriateness of her decision to dispose of property that did not belong to her without obtaining permission from the actual owner. The conversation continued with Dolores, presenting increasingly elaborate explanations for why her actions had been reasonable and appropriate under the circumstances, including claims that I had been negligent in failing to address the storage situation promptly, and that she had been providing helpful assistance rather than exceeding her authority. Her rhetorical strategies included appeals to family loyalty, practical necessity, and the importance of moving forward rather than dwelling on past decisions that could not be changed. Marcus contributed to this defensive narrative through his consistent failure to acknowledge the seriousness of what had occurred or to accept responsibility for his role in enabling the unauthorized disposal of valuable property. His responses to my attempts to discuss the legal implications and necessary remedies focused on minimizing the significance of the situation and requesting understanding for the difficult position he faced when conflicts arose between his wife and his mother. Court, I know this has been stressful for you, but we need to find ways to resolve this without creating permanent damage to our family relationships, Marcus stated during one particularly frustrating conversation about the Foundation's findings and the legal options available for addressing the improper donation. Maybe we can work something out with the Foundation that addresses your concerns without involving lawyers or making this into a bigger issue than it needs to be. His approach consistently avoided acknowledging that the situation had already become a significant legal and financial issue due to the unauthorized disposal of property worth nearly $80,000. The suggestion that involving legal counsel represented escalation rather than appropriate response to serious property rights violations demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation and his unwillingness to confront the implications of actions he had supported. The pattern of defensive responses and minimization strategies revealed that both Marcus and Dolores had developed sophisticated systems for avoiding accountability that would likely resist change unless confronted with consequences that could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Their commitment to maintaining family harmony was selective, applying only when conflicts involved challenges to their authority or convenience rather than addressing harm they had caused to other family members. The legal analysis Attorney Morrison had provided included detailed assessment of the potential damages and remedies available through formal legal proceedings, information that created leverage for negotiating resolution without necessarily requiring litigation. However, the effectiveness of such leverage depended on the willingness of the other parties to engage in good faith discussions about appropriate remedies rather than continuing their defensive strategies. The consultation process had also revealed broader implications of the improper donation that extended beyond the immediate monetary loss to include questions about insurance coverage, estate planning, and tax consequences that could affect multiple aspects of my financial situation. The donated items had been included in insurance policies and estate documentation that would require updating to reflect their loss, creating additional complications and expenses that resulted from the unauthorized disposal. Dr. Margaret Thornfield provided additional perspective on the professional and collecting community implications of the situation during a follow-up consultation about the Foundation's findings and the authentication of specific pieces within my mother's collection. Her assessment confirmed that several items possessed historical significance that extended beyond their monetary value to include research and educational importance that made their preservation particularly crucial. The loss of these pieces represents more than financial damage to your family, Dr. Thornfield explained during our telephone conversation about the Foundation's preliminary catalog descriptions and the authentication work that would be required to establish proper valuations. Several items in your mother's collection were documented examples of important design periods and makers that contributed to our understanding of decorative arts history and cultural development during specific historical periods. The historical Significance of the donated items created additional moral and ethical dimensions to the situation that extended beyond legal property rights, to include questions about cultural preservation and responsibility for maintaining access to important examples of artistic and historical heritage. The improper disposal had removed these items from documented collections, where their provenance and significance were understood and preserved. Dr. Thornfield offered to provide expert testimony and documentation that could support legal proceedings or negotiation efforts by establishing the full scope of what had been lost through the unauthorized donation. Her professional credentials and expertise would provide credible evidence about both the monetary value and the historical significance of the items in question. The consultation with Robert Chen provided similar offers of professional support and additional information about market conditions and recent sales that could establish current valuations for insurance and legal purposes. His network of professional contacts had continued monitoring auction results and private sales that could provide comparable data for determining appropriate compensation levels. The systematic approach to documenting the value and significance of the donated items had created a comprehensive foundation for addressing the situation through legal or negotiation channels. However, the defensive responses from Marcus and Dolores suggested that voluntary resolution would require confronting them with evidence and consequences that could not be dismissed through their established rationalization strategies. The weekly family dinners that had been routine features of household life became increasingly tense occasions where underlying conflicts about respect, authority, and decision-making processes created atmosphere that affected every interaction and conversation. Dolores maintained her position that she had acted appropriately and that continued discussion of the donation represented unnecessary drama that prevented the family from moving forward constructively. Marcus attempted to navigate these tensions through careful neutrality that avoided taking positions that might displease either party, but his unwillingness to address the serious legal and financial implications of the situation effectively supported his mother's defensive stance while failing to protect his wife's legitimate interests. His conflict avoidance strategies had evolved into active enabling of behavior that had caused substantial financial and emotional damage. The household dynamics during this period demonstrated how family dysfunction could persist and escalate. When problematic behavior was not confronted with appropriate consequences and accountability measures, Dolores had learned that she could exceed her authority and violate boundaries without facing meaningful repercussions, while Marcus had developed patterns of behavior that prioritized superficial harmony over justice and fairness. The professional relationships I had developed during the investigation process provided stark contrast to the family dynamics I was experiencing at home. Attorney Morrison, Dr. Thornfield, Robert Chen, and other experts treated my concerns as legitimate and provided respectful assistance based on professional standards and ethical obligations. Their responses demonstrated how functional relationships operated when based on mutual respect and shared commitment to appropriate behavior. The contrast highlighted the extent to which I had learned to accept treatment within my family that I would never tolerate in professional or social contexts. The normalization of disrespect and boundary violations had occurred gradually through consistent exposure to behavior that was presented as normal family interaction rather than dysfunction that required addressing through appropriate interventions. The discovery of the monetary value and historical significance of my mother's collection had provided objective validation for concerns that had been dismissed as emotional overreaction or excessive attachment to material possessions. The professional assessments confirmed that my instincts about the importance of preserving these items had been accurate, and that the disposal had represented poor judgment and unauthorized action rather than reasonable household management. The validation also confirmed my capacity for accurate assessment and effective advocacy when provided with appropriate information and professional support. The systematic approach to investigating the situation and building documentation had produced concrete results that exceeded initial expectations and created realistic possibilities for addressing the injustice that had occurred. The emerging evidence suggested that direct confrontation with Marcus and Dolores would be necessary to address the situation effectively, as their defensive responses indicated unwillingness to acknowledge responsibility or engage in constructive problem-solving without external pressure. The legal consultation had provided foundation for such confrontation through documentation of rights, damages, and available remedies that could not be dismissed through rationalization or minimization strategies. The preparation for confrontation required careful consideration of objectives, strategies, and potential outcomes that could range from voluntary compliance with reasonable remedies to formal legal proceedings that would establish accountability through court intervention. The decision about which approach to pursue would depend on the responses I received when presenting the evidence and demanding appropriate resolution of the situation. The transformation from accommodating family member to assertive advocate for my own rights and interests had prepared me for conversations that would determine whether the Rodriguez family dynamics could be reformed through acknowledgement of problems and commitment to change, or whether more decisive action would be necessary to protect my interests and establish appropriate boundaries for future interactions. The professional support network I had developed provided confidence and credibility for addressing family dysfunction that had persisted unchallenged for too long. The systematic investigation and documentation efforts had created foundation for demanding accountability and respect that could not be dismissed through the defensive strategies that had previously been effective in avoiding responsibility for harmful behavior. The stage was set for confrontation that would determine whether justice and fairness could be achieved through family discussions or whether formal legal intervention would be necessary to establish appropriate consequences for unauthorized actions that had caused substantial financial and emotional damage. The outcome would establish precedents for future family interactions and determine whether respectful relationships were possible within the existing household structure. The comprehensive documentation I had assembled through weeks of systematic investigation provided the foundation for developing a strategic approach to confronting the family dysfunction and addressing the unauthorized disposal of my mother's valuable collection. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal analysis was clear, and the professional support network was established. But the success of any confrontation would depend on careful planning and precise execution that addressed both legal requirements and psychological dynamics. Attorney Morrison scheduled a comprehensive strategy session to review all available options and develop a coordinated approach that would maximize the likelihood of achieving satisfactory resolution while minimizing unnecessary conflict and expense. His experience with similar family disputes had taught him the importance of combining legal pressure with diplomatic communication to create pathways for voluntary compliance before pursuing formal litigation. The strength of your documentation and the clear evidence of improper disposal give us significant leverage for negotiating resolution. Attorney Morrison explained during our meeting to review the investigation results and plan next steps. However, the effectiveness of that leverage depends on presenting the information in ways that make the consequences of non-compliance clear, while providing reasonable opportunities for voluntary remediation. The strategic planning process involved developing multiple scenarios that addressed different possible responses from Marcus and Dolores, ranging from immediate acknowledgement of responsibility and willingness to provide appropriate remediation to continued defensive denial that would require formal legal intervention to establish accountability and secure compensation for damages. The preferred approach involved presenting the evidence through structured family discussion that would allow Marcus and Dolores to understand the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences of their actions without immediately threatening litigation or other formal legal proceedings. This diplomatic approach would provide opportunities for voluntary compliance while maintaining the option of escalating to formal legal action if reasonable negotiation proved unsuccessful. Attorney Morrison recommended preparing comprehensive documentation packages that could be presented during the family discussion to establish the facts surrounding the improper disposal and the monetary value of the donated items. The packages would include professional appraisals, authentication reports, legal analysis of ownership rights, and detailed calculations of damages that extended beyond simple replacement costs to include emotional distress and related expenses. The documentation strategy required careful attention to both legal requirements and psychological impact, ensuring that the evidence was presented in ways that could not be dismissed or rationalized, while avoiding unnecessarily confrontational language that might trigger defensive responses that could complicate negotiation efforts. The goal was to create understanding of the situation, rather than simply asserting legal rights through adversarial communication. Dr. Margaret Thornfield contributed to the documentation preparation by providing detailed written assessments of the historical significance and current market value of specific items within my mother's collection. Her professional credentials and expertise provided credible foundation for establishing the importance of the donated pieces and the magnitude of the loss that had resulted from their improper disposal. The authentication and valuation reports I am preparing will provide objective evidence that cannot be disputed through subjective opinions about the significance or worth of your mother's collection, Dr. Thornfield explained during our consultation about the documentation requirements. For the planned family discussion, professional assessments carry weight that personal opinions cannot match when establishing facts about monetary value and historical importance. Robert Chen provided similar documentation regarding the specific pieces he had identified at the Riverside Community Foundation and their current market valuations based on recent sales of comparable items. His reports included detailed photographs and technical descriptions that demonstrated the sophistication and quality of the donated pieces while establishing baseline values for compensation calculations. The coordination with the Riverside Community Foundation involved developing agreements that would preserve the donated items in their current condition, while legal questions about ownership and authorization were resolved through family discussion and potential formal proceedings. Margaret Williams had confirmed the Foundation's willingness to cooperate with legitimate ownership claims while protecting their organization's interests and charitable mission. The Foundation's legal counsel had reviewed the situation and confirmed that their standard procedures for accepting donations included provisions for addressing ownership disputes when adequate evidence was presented by parties claiming legitimate rights to contributed items. The documentation I had assembled met their requirements for initiating formal review of the donation authorization and potentially reversing the transfer if ownership claims were substantiated. This cooperation from the Foundation provided additional leverage for family negotiations by demonstrating that the donated items could be recovered through legal channels if voluntary agreements could not be reached. The Foundation's willingness to work with legitimate ownership claims eliminated arguments that the donation was irreversible or that pursuing remediation would be futile. The psychological preparation for confronting Marcus and Dolores required developing communication strategies that would maintain composure and effectiveness despite the emotional intensity of addressing systematic disrespect and boundary violations that had characterized our family relationships for extended periods. The confrontation represented more than addressing a single incident. It would establish precedents for future interactions and determine whether respectful relationships were possible within the existing family structure. The preparation process included rehearsing key points and responses to anticipated defensive arguments, ensuring that important information would be communicated clearly despite potential interruptions or attempts to redirect the conversation toward irrelevant issues. The systematic approach to planning the confrontation reflected lessons learned from previous unsuccessful attempts to address family dysfunction through unstructured emotional appeals. Professional coaching from Attorney Morrison provided valuable guidance about maintaining focus on specific legal issues and factual evidence, rather than allowing the discussion to devolve into personal criticism or emotional arguments that could undermine the effectiveness of the presentation. The goal was to establish facts and consequences rather than to express feelings or seek acknowledgement of past hurts that might not be relevant to achieving practical resolution. The timing of the confrontation required careful consideration of family schedules and psychological factors that could affect the likelihood of productive discussion. Attorney Morrison recommended scheduling the meeting during periods when all parties would be well rested and free from competing obligations. That might create distractions or excuses for avoiding serious engagement with the presented information. The location for the family discussion was selected to provide neutral territory that would minimize the influence of household dynamics and authority structures that had historically favored Dolores's preferences and Marcus's conflict avoidance strategies. The meeting would occur in Attorney Morrison's conference room, where professional environment and legal context would reinforce the seriousness of the situation while providing neutral facilitation if needed. The preparation of specific demands and remediation proposals required balancing several competing objectives, including recovering the monetary value of the donated items, establishing accountability for unauthorized actions, and creating binding agreements that would prevent similar violations in the future. The demands needed to be reasonable and achievable while adequately addressing the financial and emotional damages that had resulted from the improper disposal. The monetary compensation calculations included not only the established market value of the donated items but also related expenses such as insurance adjustments, professional consultation fees, and legal costs that had resulted from the need to investigate and address the unauthorized disposal. The total damages exceeded $90,000 when all direct and indirect costs were included in the analysis. However, the practical considerations of family relationships and the defendant's financial capacity suggested that purely monetary remediation might not be feasible or appropriate for resolving the situation. Alternative approaches could include structured payment plans, acknowledgement of responsibility, and binding agreements about future decision-making processes that would prevent similar violations while preserving family relationships. The non-monetary aspects of the desired resolution included formal acknowledgement from both Marcus and Dolores that they had exceeded their authority and violated my ownership rights through the unauthorized donation of valuable personal property. This acknowledgement would provide validation for my concerns and establish clear boundaries for future family interactions. The preparation process also involved developing contingency plans for various possible outcomes of the family discussion, including immediate acceptance of responsibility and willingness to provide appropriate remediation, partial acknowledgement with negotiations about specific terms, and complete denial or refusal to engage constructively with the presented evidence. Each contingency scenario included predetermined responses and escalation strategies that would maintain momentum toward resolution while avoiding unnecessary delay or compromise of fundamental principles about respect and accountability. The systematic approach to contingency planning reflected lessons learned from previous family conflicts, where lack of preparation had resulted in unsatisfactory outcomes. The documentation preparation required creating multiple versions of the evidence, packages tailored to different audiences and objectives. The version prepared for Marcus emphasized the legal implications of his role in enabling the unauthorized disposal and the potential consequences for his financial security and family relationships. The version prepared for Dolores focused on the factual evidence about the value and significance of the donated items and the clear violation of ownership rights involved in their disposal. The coordination with professional contacts ensured that expert testimony and additional documentation would be available if needed to support formal legal proceedings in the event that voluntary resolution proved unsuccessful. Dr. Thornfield, Robert Chen, and other professionals had confirmed their willingness to provide formal statements and court testimony that would establish the value and significance of the donated items. The systematic approach to preparing for confrontation had transformed my perspective from emotional victim-seeking acknowledgement to strategic advocate pursuing specific remedies through coordinated professional action. The comprehensive documentation and expert support provided confidence and credibility that could not be dismissed through the defensive strategies that had previously been effective in avoiding accountability. The preparation process had also revealed my own capacity for complex project management and strategic planning that had produced measurable results and created realistic possibilities for achieving justice through appropriate channels. The skills I had developed through professional experience proved directly applicable to personal challenges that required persistence, attention to detail, and coordinated action among multiple parties with different expertise and objectives. The transformation from passive family member, accepting unacceptable treatment, to active advocate, pursuing legitimate remedies through professional channels, represented fundamental change in how I understood my rights and responsibilities within family relationships. The systematic approach to addressing dysfunction had created foundation for demanding respect and accountability that extended beyond the immediate situation to include precedents for future interactions. The comprehensive preparation for confrontation had established clear objectives, documented evidence, professional support, and strategic plans that provided realistic prospects for achieving satisfactory resolution of the improper disposal, while establishing healthier boundaries for ongoing family relationships. The woman who had learned to accommodate unreasonable demands was ready to demand reasonable treatment through coordinated professional action that could not be ignored or dismissed. The foundation had been established for confrontation that would determine whether justice and fairness could be achieved through family discussion or whether formal legal intervention would be necessary to establish appropriate consequences for unauthorized actions that had caused substantial financial and emotional damage. The systematic preparation had created optimal conditions for successful resolution while maintaining options for escalation if voluntary compliance proved insufficient. The morning of the scheduled family meeting arrived with unseasonable clarity, as though the universe had conspired to provide perfect conditions for the confrontation that would determine the future direction of my relationships with Marcus and Dolores. The comprehensive preparation I had undertaken during the previous weeks had created optimal circumstances for presenting evidence that could not be dismissed or rationalized away through the defensive strategies that had previously enabled continued dysfunction. Attorney Morrison's conference room provided the professional environment necessary for serious discussion about legal implications and financial consequences that extended far beyond family disagreements or personal preferences. The neutral location eliminated household dynamics and authority structures that had historically favored avoidance of accountability and minimization of legitimate concerns about respect and boundary violations. The documentation packages I had prepared contained irrefutable evidence about the monetary value and historical significance of my mother's collection, professional assessments that could not be disputed through subjective opinions, and legal analysis that established clear violations of ownership rights and potential consequences for unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property. The systematic approach to building the case had created foundation for demanding justice that transcended emotional appeals or family loyalty considerations. Marcus arrived at the law office appearing uncomfortable and defensive, his usual confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety about circumstances that had moved beyond family discussions into formal legal territory. His attempts to maintain casual conversation during the preliminary minutes before the meeting began revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation and his continued hope that diplomatic solutions could minimize the consequences of actions he had supported. Dolores entered the conference room with characteristic authority and composure, presenting herself as someone prepared to address unreasonable complaints through rational explanation and appeals to family harmony. Her confident bearing suggested continued belief that she could justify her decisions and redirect responsibility toward my allegedly excessive reactions to normal household management processes. The contrast between their demeanor and the professional environment highlighted the disconnect between their perception of the situation as family disagreement and the reality of legal violations that had created substantial financial liability and potential criminal exposure for unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property. The systematic documentation would soon eliminate any ambiguity about the seriousness of what had occurred. Attorney Morrison began the meeting with formal introduction of the participants and explanation of the purpose for gathering legal consultation about property rights violations and potential remedies for unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property. His professional presentation established the legal context and serious implications of the situation, while providing structured framework for reviewing evidence and discussing resolution options. We are here today to address the unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property belonging to Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, including items with substantial monetary value and historical significance that were donated to the Riverside Community Foundation without proper authorization from the legal owner, Attorney Morrison stated while distributing copies of the comprehensive documentation packages to Marcus and Dolores. The presentation began with establishment of ownership rights and legal authority regarding my mother's estate and the personal property that had been stored temporarily in the Rodriguez family garage following her death. The documentation included estate settlement records, insurance policies, and professional correspondence that demonstrated my clear legal ownership of the items that had been disposed of without consultation or consent. Marcus and Dolores reviewed the initial documentation, with increasing attention and concern as the implications of the legal analysis became apparent. The evidence was presented systematically and objectively, eliminating opportunities for emotional deflection or subjective interpretation of facts that had been established through professional evaluation and legal research. The monetary valuation section of the presentation provided comprehensive evidence about the current market value of items within my mother's collection, including detailed appraisals from certified professionals who specialized in vintage jewelry, ceramics, and decorative arts. The individual assessments and aggregate valuation exceeded $80,000, with additional items that had not yet been fully evaluated, potentially increasing the total value substantially. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's written assessment provided authoritative confirmation of the historical significance and exceptional quality of specific pieces within the collection, establishing that the donated items represented museum-quality examples of important design periods and makers. Her professional credentials and expertise could not be questioned or dismissed through layperson opinions about the significance or worth of vintage collectibles. Robert Chen's documentation regarding the specific items he had identified at the Riverside Community Foundation included detailed photographs and technical descriptions that demonstrated the sophistication and rarity of pieces that had been cataloged as ordinary costume jewelry and decorative accessories. His market analysis provided current valuations based on recent sales of comparable items through established auction houses and private dealers. The legal analysis section of the presentation established clear violations of property rights and potential civil and criminal liability for unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property. Attorney Morrison explained the applicable statutes and case law that supported claims for monetary damages, emotional distress compensation, and potential criminal charges related to conversion and theft of valuable personal property. The comprehensive documentation had transformed the family disagreement into serious legal matter, with substantial financial implications and potential criminal exposure that could not be resolved through appeals to family loyalty or requests for understanding and forgiveness. The evidence was objective, professional, and irrefutable, eliminating defensive strategies that had previously been effective in avoiding accountability. Dolores attempted initial resistance through familiar rhetorical approaches that minimized the significance of the situation and redirected responsibility toward my allegedly excessive attachment to material possessions. However, her arguments were immediately countered by professional documentation that established objective facts about monetary value and historical significance that could not be disputed through personal opinions or family relationship considerations. Mrs. Rodriguez, the professional appraisals and legal analysis presented here demonstrate that your disposal of these items exceeded your authority and violated clearly established ownership rights. Attorney Morrison responded to Dolores's attempts to justify her actions through practical necessity and family assistance arguments. The monetary value and historical significance of the donated items are established facts that cannot be changed through alternative interpretations. of your intentions or motivations. Marcus recognized more quickly than his mother that the situation had moved beyond family dynamics into legal territory where emotional appeals and conflict avoidance strategies would not provide effective protection against serious financial and legal consequences. His questions focused on potential remedies and negotiation options rather than disputing the fundamental facts about unauthorized disposal and property rights violations. The presentation continued with detailed calculation of damages that extended beyond simple replacement costs to include related expenses, professional consultation fees, legal costs, and emotional distress compensation that reflected the comprehensive impact of the unauthorized disposal. The total damages exceeded $90,000 when all direct and indirect costs were included in the analysis. The magnitude of the financial exposure created immediate focus on resolution options and remediation strategies, rather than continued attempts to justify past actions or minimize the significance of what had occurred. The systematic documentation had eliminated ambiguity about liability and consequences while providing foundation for serious discussion about appropriate remedies. Attorney Morrison presented structured options for addressing the situation that ranged from voluntary compliance with comprehensive remediation demands to formal legal proceedings that would establish accountability through court intervention and potential criminal prosecution. The presentation emphasized preference for negotiated resolution, while making clear the consequences of non-compliance with reasonable remediation proposals. The voluntary compliance option included immediate acknowledgement of responsibility, structured payment of monetary damages, formal agreements about future decision-making processes, and coordination with the Riverside Community Foundation to recover donated items or secure appropriate compensation for their loss. The comprehensive approach addressed both financial remediation and procedural changes necessary to prevent similar violations. The formal legal proceedings option included civil litigation for monetary damages and emotional distress compensation, coordination with criminal prosecutors regarding potential charges for unauthorized disposal of valuable personal property, and public disclosure of the facts surrounding the violations through court proceedings and media coverage. The potential consequences extended beyond financial liability to include reputation damage and criminal exposure. The stark contrast between voluntary compliance and formal legal proceedings created powerful incentives for serious engagement with remediation proposals while maintaining clear consequences for continued resistance or attempts to minimize the significance of the violations. The systematic approach to presenting options provided pathways for resolution while establishing accountability that could not be avoided. Dolores's initial defensive responses gradually shifted toward recognition of the serious legal and financial implications as the comprehensive documentation eliminated opportunities for rationalization or deflection. Her questions began focusing on specific remediation requirements and negotiation possibilities rather than continued attempts to justify her unauthorized actions. Marcus demonstrated immediate willingness to address the situation constructively and explore remediation options that would resolve the legal issues while preserving family relationships. His responses indicated recognition that the systematic documentation had established facts that could not be disputed and consequences that required serious attention and appropriate response. The transformation in their demeanor from defensive confidence to concerned attention reflected the effectiveness of systematic preparation and professional presentation that had eliminated ambiguity about the seriousness of the situation and the necessity of addressing violations through appropriate remedies. The comprehensive evidence had created foundation for productive discussion about resolution options. The meeting concluded with agreement to review the remediation proposals and provide formal responses within 1 week regarding their willingness to comply voluntarily with comprehensive demands or their preference for resolution through formal legal proceedings. The timeline provided adequate opportunity for consultation and decision-making while maintaining momentum toward definitive resolution. The systematic presentation had achieved primary objectives of establishing facts, demonstrating consequences, and creating structured pathways for addressing the unauthorized disposal through appropriate remedies. The comprehensive preparation had produced optimal conditions for achieving justice while providing opportunities for voluntary compliance that could preserve family relationships. The professional environment and legal context had eliminated opportunities for emotional manipulation or conflict avoidance strategies that had previously prevented accountability for boundary violations and disrespectful treatment. The systematic approach to confrontation had created conditions where truth and consequences could not be avoided through defensive rhetoric or appeals to family loyalty. The courage required to initiate formal legal consultation and present comprehensive evidence had been sustained through systematic preparation and professional support that provided credibility and confidence for demanding appropriate treatment. The transformation from accommodating family member to assertive advocate had been validated through measurable results and professional recognition. The woman who had learned to accept unacceptable treatment had successfully demonstrated her capacity for strategic action and effective advocacy that could produce meaningful change in circumstances that had previously seemed unchangeable. The systematic approach to addressing dysfunction had created precedent for demanding respect and accountability in all future family interactions. The foundation had been established for resolution that would either validate the effectiveness of professional advocacy and systematic preparation, or demonstrate the necessity of formal legal intervention when voluntary compliance proved insufficient for addressing serious violations of legal rights and personal dignity. The outcome would determine whether respectful relationships were possible within reformed family dynamics or whether decisive action would be required to protect fundamental interests and values. The 48 hours following the confrontation in Attorney Morrison's conference room brought developments that fundamentally altered the scope and implications of the situation in ways that none of us had anticipated. The systematic presentation of evidence had achieved its intended purpose of establishing facts and consequences, but it had also initiated a chain of communications and discoveries that would reveal connections extending far beyond the immediate family dynamics and property rights violations. Robert Chen contacted me the morning after the family meeting with information that had emerged through his continued monitoring of the antiques community's response to inquiries about my mother's collection. His network of professional contacts had produced leads that suggested the donated items represented only a portion of a much larger and more significant collection that my mother had assembled over several decades through relationships and acquisitions that demonstrated extraordinary sophistication and expertise. Mrs. Rodriguez, I have received several calls from colleagues who recognize descriptions of pieces from your mother's collection, Robert Chen explained during our telephone conversation about the expanding scope of the investigation. The responses suggest that your mother was far more prominent within the collecting community than any of us realized, with relationships and acquisitions that extended well beyond the regional network we have been exploring. The information Robert Chen had gathered indicated that my mother had maintained correspondence and business relationships with dealers and collectors throughout the country, participating in specialized auctions and private sales that had provided access to museum-quality pieces with exceptional provenance and historical significance. Her expertise had been recognized by professionals who regarded her as a serious collector rather than casual buyer of decorative objects. Dr. Margaret Thornfield provided corroborating information during a follow-up consultation about the authentication work she had been conducting on behalf of my investigation. Her research had revealed documentation suggesting that my mother had been consulted by museums and academic institutions regarding specific pieces and their historical context, indicating a level of expertise and professional recognition that extended far beyond personal collecting interests. Your mother's knowledge of decorative arts and design history was quite remarkable, Dr. Thornfield explained while reviewing correspondence she had discovered in her professional files. She contributed to several research projects and provided information that assisted with museum acquisitions and scholarly publications. Her insights were valued by professionals who recognized her expertise and systematic approach to understanding the cultural significance of the pieces she collected. The emerging picture of my mother's professional relationships and expertise provided new context for understanding the significance of the donated items and the broader implications of their unauthorized disposal. The collection had not simply represented personal accumulation of beautiful objects, but systematic assembly of historically significant pieces that contributed to scholarly understanding and cultural preservation efforts. The revelation that my mother had been actively involved in professional research and museum consultation created additional dimensions to the legal case and potential damages that extended beyond monetary value to include loss of scholarly resources and cultural heritage materials. The unauthorized disposal had removed items from documented collections where their provenance and significance were preserved for future research and educational purposes. Attorney Morrison reviewed the expanding documentation with renewed attention to the potential implications for both civil and criminal proceedings. The evidence of my mother's professional standing within the collecting community provided additional foundation for establishing the significance of the unauthorized disposal and the negligence involved in discarding items without proper evaluation or consultation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.